Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit the subscribe button for plenty more interesting conversations to come. This is a show about cities and how they work, but today we're going to take a little bit of a detour and talk about something else that is related to cities, but is not purely about cities. And that's stamps, those little things you put on your envelope, at least when you used to mail letters. And they have a whole fascinating history. And we're going to talk to somebody who has a whole fascinating history with stamps. That's David Luberoff, who is the Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. But we're not talking housing, we're talking stamps. Isn't that right, David?
That is right. Although I think there's more of a city planning connection than you're given credit.
Well, I suspect there is, because I know you've dug a lot into this, and I can't wait to just jump right into it. David, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you. Pleasure to be
All
here.
right, so let's get into it. So stamps. First of all, why do I know about your stamp collection, and what is your stamp collection?
I actually think of it as my father's stamp collection. I'll duck out of the way. There's a series of blue notebooks back there, which were notebooks that my father collected stamps in the 40s and 50s into the early 60s. And then, as best I can figure, he put them away, which means I never saw them. I never saw him collecting them. When my mom moved for the second time after my dad died, when she was moving into a really downsizing, she urged me to take these and to get her off my back. I did. And then they just sat down here in my study.
So let's spend a second on
that. And then about 3 weeks into COVID, when I was like, I'm going to be home for a while, and I don't know, I don't have a lot to do. I had this idea. My original idea was we also had a box of letters that my father wrote to my mother during World War II from Europe, where he was serving, and I was going to go through those, and then I have no idea why, but the day after his birthday in April, I said, I'm going to take these out and I want to see if I can find a stamp every day that relates somehow to that day, like it was issued on that day. And I'll put a little Facebook post up. And the first time I did it was on April 18th.
All right, so pause here for just a second. Let me just tell you. So your dad was a stamp collector in the 40s and 50s and 60s. He died. Your mother had these, and then she's moving. Yeah. And she says to her son, David, hey, these were your dad's. Why don't you take them?
Yeah. Well, yeah, my mom had this great habit of, both my parents were pack rats. And so she would pick some object and convince you that if you would just take that, she'd be able to clear everything out. It was like kind of a reverse of Lucy and the football. And so it was the stamps. And I took them, and I assumed that I'd probably sell them, but I wasn't going to do that till after she had passed away, because she would have, that she just wouldn't have been able to let them go.
So let me ask you. So your dad was a collector. Was this something he passed on to you? Were you a collector as well?
Nope. I mean, I collect other things, not the way he did. He tried to get me interested in like 1967 or so. I think I did it for like a week, and then it just didn't resonate for me. And for the most part, stamp collecting is a dying art. I'm told if you go to the collector's shows, it's a little bit like going to the continuing care community dining room.
Right. So you got these binders full of stamps. You're not a collector yourself. They belong to your dad way back when, and you're just sitting on them. And then COVID happened, right?
Go ahead. A little bit before that, my mom had passed away in spring of 2019, and sometime in the fall, I was like, I had to deal with these stamps, and so I started trying to figure out what I had. Think about a stamp for a second, right? You have to put something on the stamp other than a number, right? And it turns out that people begin to figure out that there's some messaging in that. And so there's who who or what winds up on a stamp turns out to be a really interesting reflection of who or what at any point in time, controls that process. And in particularly, I think starting in the 20s through the 60s, stamp collecting was a really serious thing. A lot of people did it, and a lot of people began to see the possibilities of it. So what starts to happen is I'm looking at the stamps, I'm trying to understand the story behind it, and the story behind the stamp often is cycling into understanding what's happening in the world today. I can give you a great example of that.
Yeah, walk
I'm
us
go down
into
that
that.
rabbit
Walk us
hole.
into that a little bit.
I'm sorry.
No, sorry. Just take us into that whole
So,
process a little bit.
I started posting, and then I would post a little bit of, more about like, well, what was this thing about?
And just to be clear, your goal was to write something.
My goal was to write something every day, but I thought it would be like, 2 paragraphs like this. This is a picture. This is a stamp issued to honor when the first Norwegians came to America. And then at the end of April, there was a stamp that was connected to the opening of the New York World's Fair in 1939 in Flushing Meadow. And I realized I just had all these, it's a really interesting story. There are all kinds of ways that intersects with my life. And I wrote a fairly long post, probably 1,400 words, that went through all these different things from, that's where this iconic scene in The Great Gatsby happens, to it's a Robert Moses project, to the company my father worked for in 1964, did the engineering for the big fountain that was part of the 64 World's Fair, to I grew up as a Mets fan, and Shea Stadium, which is part of the Flushing Meadow, or was part of the Flushing Meadows complex, was holy ground for me. And in 1969, I took some grass from there and planted it in my parents' front yard. But when we tore up the field after the Mets won just the National League Championship, I'm not sure what we were thinking about the fact that the World Series was about to happen there. So that was sort of, it began to say, oh, there's this really interesting way you can open up these stories. And then about a month later, there is a stamp. I still find this astonishing. In 1951, there was a stamp issued to honor the last gathering of a group called the Confederate War Veterans of America. So this is like the VFW for Confederate soldiers. And at its height had, well over 100,000 members. And this was right after the George Floyd death of George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matters protests, and the fights about statues. And it turns out that this is the organization that was responsible for putting up many of those statues.
Oh, wait. So slow down a little bit. So the George Floyd.
So the George Floyd thing is happening, and I'm looking at this stamp going, in what version of reality?
Yeah.
Would you, we don't have a stamp that honors the last Nazi war veterans.
Did you know what you were looking at when you first saw this? You knew what it was about.
It says Confederate War Veterans. And I was like, wow, I can't, and so sometimes it'll be like that. I'll see a stamp and I'll be like, I can't wait till that day is coming. So on May 30th, I was like, this is a really unbelievable stamp. I was just rereading the post, and I said, look, this is stuff that's not really very pleasant. So I was quoting from some speeches. One of the famous statues associated with this group was the so-called Silent Sam statue that was for many years at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And the speech is made, on the occasion of its dedication. The person who was behind it, who was a major power broker in North Carolina, was a virulent racist. And so
and you're finding all this out in your sort of background research
about
this stamp that you're going to write about.
Finding out in the background research, so usually in the morning I'll noodle around a little bit over my coffee to figure out what's the stamp that day. And, again, over coffee, I might, read the Wikipedia entry about that person or event and start Googling. I've been a writer and researcher much of my life, and I'm pretty good at finding information. And I just, I let it stew for a while. And then typically, in the evening, I'll come back and having sort of stewed on it for a while, think about both what's an aspect of this story that I find really interesting, or what, as it's sort of marinated for the day or longer, does it spur, what image is it spurring in my head? Does it spur a family memory? Does it make me think of, so sometimes it's like the loosest of loose connections.
Right. Right.
uh,
Yeah,
but
it
that's the
sort
way
of
my mind
sparks a
works.
thought
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah,
something, and then you
yeah.
go with that thought. But where, so that let's stay with the Confederate War veterans. What'd you write about in
I mean,
that
I
episode?
basically wrote about, kind of like, this is really unbelievable. And let me tell you about in this case, let me tell you about the Confederate War veterans, because it is so linked to what's going, here's this stamp. And what does it say about us as a country that I mean, we would never issue that stamp in 2020, I don't think. I think I wrote about this, that, in like 1917, this group has its convention in Washington, D.C., and the president of the United States addresses them. So Woodrow Wilson, who turns out to be a virulent racist, but it's also, Wilson basically trying to build a national support for war, and so he's like, well, I guess I'll say nice things about these people. So it became increasingly this way to think about this sort of past that informed all of the present debates. There have been times
Well,
when,
I was going to ask you about that, just because it seems like you open up these folders, these binders that are actually
yeah,
over your shoulders. We
yeah,
look,
yeah,
and it's like this weird sort of, they're historical, they're related to your dad, but there's also a whole bunch of associations in your own mind, both personal and
yeah,
professional
yeah,
and
yeah,
historical,
yeah.
and it's sort of these multiple layers or these different doors you can walk through. It sounds
My
fascinating.
one of my daughters says this is sort of, it's some version of like, this is just like opening up dad's head and seeing what goes on, because I do make sort of sometimes seemingly random connections, and that's really fun. And sometimes I don't know where, I have a vague idea what I want to write about, and I
Yeah,
sometimes don't know what the post is about until I finished it, and then I
yeah,
go back to the beginning and go, oh, okay, because I am an ex-journalist, so I
yeah,
want there to be a lead.
right.
um I mean, I don't show you everything at the beginning.
Yeah.
um and it's been fascinating. So I have done this every single day now since April
Well,
8th.
let me ask you on that. So you're a writer. I mean, you have a background in writing. You do a lot of writing. What's it been like just sitting down and cranking out these words? What's that experience?
It's made me a much better writer.
Right.
I think. Sometimes it's a pain in the ass. Sometimes, if the goal is to do one a day, like, does it matter? Every once in a while, I think I've posted one at 12:02.
Right. Right.
But in many ways, it's been a great way to spend the pandemic. In many ways, it sometimes has impinged on other things, and it's been really, because I've been doing it through Facebook.
Right.
Not that that was a strategic choice. I'm just not that technologically literate. Um, it's also been this fascinating way of reconnecting with a bunch of people I went to high school with that I have had zero contact with,
Hmm.
for, you can see how gray my hair is, for many years, and other folks. So it's been a nice way to sort of stay connected.
And they're these wonderful stories, and they do range from historical to
Yeah.
very, very personal. There
Yeah.
was one, and I remember you posting about your father when he was a soldier during the war, and it was sort of, he had a favorite war story that somehow this stamp triggered off this
Yeah, yeah.
memory
I mean,
of.
it was a story of, on some anniversary of radio communications, and yeah, I can't even remember the exact thought process. And my dad didn't tell a lot of war stories like many veterans, but there was this one particular story. He was a radio man. That was the connection, and there was a particular story that the Nazis had actually gotten a hold of a radio and were basically saying, able to Baker, that because that way they could figure out where the headquarters space was, and hone in and shell it. And my father just picked up his radio and was like, shut up, Baker, Abel isn't who you think he is, for which my father apparently was disciplined because he didn't use correct radio protocol. which he sort of found amusing. So again, that was one that only very tangentially had anything in the world to do with the stamp.
Question that's been on my mind for a long time is, who chooses what goes on a stamp? How does that work?
That's a fascinating question. And it's from past tense. Who chose this? It really, in the end, appears to have been the decision of the Postmaster General, which for many, many decades was a very important political position. So any number of like party chairmen or people's campaign managers become the Postmaster General. It's a patronage job. But it also, as people begin to understand the power, that behind this, they want to be able to sort of decide what gets selected. Congress at varying points has gotten involved. So in the late 40s and early 50s, there were some accounts I ran across, 100 different bills filed to put, my thing, my city, whatever. And so then there became an informal mechanism of like the Postmaster General and, the relevant committee chairs. In the 50s, the then Postmaster General started to set up some advisory commissions, both on what gets chosen, and then starting in the 60s in particular, how is it going to be portrayed? So it goes from being something that's always done in-house by some in-house engravers to beginning to commission noted graphic artists. And if you look at stamps from the 60s, you can see a real evolution in their design from these sort of classic mid-century stamps.
Yeah.
So there's a political process. One other quick thing on Franklin Roosevelt was an inveterate stamp collector, and so all of the stamps that came out in the 30s, Roosevelt approved, often suggested what would be on stamps and what the design would be. And you read this and you're like, wait, excuse me, Franklin, there's a depression going on, fascism's on the rise, and you're saying, no, I don't like that picture of the Grand Coulee Dam. Like, what?
Yeah, that's incredible. And it's a subject we haven't touched on, but the design component, right? They are works of art at some level.
Oh, they're extraordinary. We shouldn't touch on the design component because I'm just not a design person, but I have some design friends who have said at least check to see who designed this stamp. And sometimes that in and of itself is a fascinating story.
All right, I want to put you on the spot a little bit because you've been in and around public policy,
Yep.
your working life, and you now are focused on housing issues.
Yep.
How do these stamps relate to cities? This is a show about cities and how they work.
Yep.
Here's a pop quiz.
Okay.
How are they related?
They're a couple.
Yeah.
I think actually one of the most interesting. So through the first U.S. stamps, first stamps are about 1840. The first U.S. stamps are 1847. From 1847 to 1893, the only thing that's on stamps are dead white people, dead white men. Let's be specific.
Right.
Okay. Mainly former presidents. A lot of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of Franklin. Right. And then I don't know how it happens, but in 1893, there's this big exposition in Chicago, the Columbian Exposition, which is partly to say, look, Chicago's not the frontier. We're in this great modern city. And they convinced the post office to issue, it's like 12 different stamps that are all about Christopher Columbus, but they're also about the Columbian Exposition. And it is, and it's a huge hit. Collectors go nuts.
Okay.
They can't.
Is that the beginning of stamp collecting?
I don't know if that's the beginning of stamp collecting, but I think that it's I suspect it is a seminal moment in stamp collecting. And apparently Americans would go to Europe with these Columbian stamps because the Europeans loved them. So, if you were doing your Henry James, European adventure. And so then there's a whole series of stamps through the late 1900s, particularly up through the 30s and 40s that are about these different expositions. So it's like, how do I put my city on the map? So
interesting.
Very much, and that's sort of been a lot of the work I've always done professionally, which is sort of kind of this interplay of urban politics and planning and all this other stuff. So all of the New York World's Fair
Right.
is an exercise. And the New York World's Fair was an attempt to reclaim some, marshy land that was ash piles, to turn it in. It was Robert Moses wanted to build a park bigger than Central Park.
And you actually, in your post, you actually quote The Great Gatsby, where
Yeah,
there's a description of a train going past these
yeah.
ash piles.
It's I think it's towards the end of the book, but yeah, it's this iconic. I mean, I don't remember a lot of The Great Gatsby, but I remembered that there was that section, and again, the wonders of the internet, I was able to sort of find it. Yeah. And the park, which doesn't get built till the late 60s, is, it is bigger than Central Park. It's actually an amazing park,
That's
where the
fascinating.
tennis center is, and all that. The other thing that does show up is, urban landmarks, pieces of infrastructure. So the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, when it opened, at the time the longest bridge, and what turned out to be for decades the last bridge in New York, got a stamp when it opened. And that was one where I saw that stamp and I just had this vivid memory of driving across that bridge with my mother, who was sort of fascinated with infrastructure in the same way that I have. So sometimes it's just about that.
Does your father actually, did he have that stamp? Do you have that
My,
stamp?
my mother did have, or my father did have that stamp. So with one exception, I have always written about a stamp that was in his collection. And the one exception,
What's the exception?
the one exception again, which is fascinating, and again relates to cities. On June, I think it was on Juneteenth, I wanted to write. It was the anniversary of the dedication of the famous statue in D.C., which also used to be a copy, which was in Boston, of Lincoln with the slave who's just been freed, starting to rise, but the person is kneeling and Lincoln is standing. It became a very controversial statue about, why is this black man leaning in front of the great white emancipator? The day it was dedicated, Frederick Douglass spoke at the dedication in Washington, D.C., in just unbelievably powerful speech, where he basically says, look, was Lincoln perfect? No. Did Lincoln turn out to be the vehicle that led to our liberation because that's what and he had to do it in the particular way that he did? Yeah. And so he's both appreciative, but I've come to greatly appreciate Frederick Douglass because he's popped up a couple times. And I just thought this was too good. And then since I get to make up the rules, it's my game, right? I said, I think it's actually metaphorically appropriate that I don't have this stamp.
Is your goal to write through a complete year, 365 days, get 365?
It wasn't my original goal.
Yeah.
But I think after I'd done it for about 2 or 3 months, and people were like, started to ask that question, I was like, I don't know. I mean, what I've always said is I was going to do it until I didn't want to do it anymore. I think I'm going to stop on probably April 17th, which was my father's birthday. I will have done it for a year. I'm hoping that sometime after April 17th, I get to, have other things to do than sit at home, at night. And that feels like, it sort of feels like a whole. So my goal is to get to April 17th, at which point I will have 365 posts. On average, they're probably about 1,000 words. So that's the equivalent of about 3 books. So I can't just paste them all together. I don't think anybody would want to read that. Is there a book there? I have no idea. That wasn't the point. The point was, to do this exploration. And I might over the next, after April 17th, I might go back and read, sort of say, well, what did I post on this a year ago? And, did I miss something or reflect on it? I don't know. But I'm going to slow down.
Yeah. Would you take a second just to reflect on the COVID aspect of it? Unplanned was born because COVID happened, and we were all stuck inside, and we were thinking about the world and life itself, and all cities stopped for at least a day.
I've been writing. I mean, a lot of times I write about COVID on. Usually, I find the stamp that connects to the day, but the other day, which was sort of a seminal anniversary for me on a 1-year anniversary, I was like, no, I want to write about this thing And I actually went and found a stamp that was a picture of Dante, because this idea of that we've been through this hell, but also this purgatory, and at times this heaven, right? That there are things we've discovered. So COVID's been right at the center of it, writing about COVID, writing about, there've been a bunch of posts about what leadership really looks like, particularly under the last administration and COVID. And it's been a coping mechanism. I have a cousin who lives in Vietnam who called me completely out of the blue. I haven't talked to the guy in 15 years. One night my phone rings, and he's been reading these, and he knew my father, really knew and loved my father. And he said, "This is your father's way of taking care of you in this year of COVID." And I was like, I hadn't thought of that, but I wonder if there's a part of me that thinks there's a truth to that. And it goes back to that story I said, which was I was going to write about these letters, and some voice said, no, go write about stamps.
David Luberoff, over the Joint Center for Housing Studies. Next time, maybe we'll talk about housing, but this time you've shared a really wonderful story. You post them on Facebook. I've seen them on LinkedIn. I hope you do compile them at some place. I think there's so much here, both of personal history, but also American history, really.
Well, I've appreciated the opportunity to rant and rave about it, but also I appreciate that your questions got me thinking a little bit more about what these things are, how they relate to my other passions, and what I've been doing. So thank you for the opportunity.